Well, let's talk more about this now with Firas Maksad. He's an adjunct professor at George Washington University, and he joins us now from the U.S. Capitol. So let's talk, first of all, about these latest efforts on the diplomatic front to end this conflict. Do you think that they will, I mean, how optimistic are you that they will go anywhere?
Well, I think it's not surprising that there's very little optimism in the air. Both the Russians and the Americans want to have the veneer of diplomacy for their own different reasons. I think both are interested in doing some conflict management and some containment of the Syrian conflict. But there's also a realization that the elements on the ground are just not together, and more importantly, the regional players, Saudi Arabia and Turkey on one hand, Iran on the other, their geopolitical interests don't overlap. There is very little overlap in interests there, and I think we saw that play out in the verbal clashes between both the Saudi and the Iranian foreign minister in Vienna. So very little room for optimism.
Yeah, well, there is this view, of course, that all of these regional players and outside forces are simply making this conflict worse by fueling it. But there's also another argument that says doing nothing won't solve it either. I mean, it just gets to the point that there are very few good options in Syria.
There are very few good options in Syria, and this is why many people who know Syria and who know the Middle East well had been urging the Obama administration and other world powers to do more about Syria earlier on in the conflict. Right now, the conflict, at least from a Washington perspective, is at least a two-part conflict. One that is between the Syrian opposition and that of the regime, and another one, perhaps related but still separate in many ways, against ISIS or Daesh. And U.S. foreign policy right now towards that country is being reformatted to fit along these two lines. One in northwestern Syria to combat ISIS, and another one, diplomatic largely, that we see that tries to figure out some way forward with the Russians, but that, again, is not moving forward much.
So you expect this conflict to rumble on for some time then?
Yes, a very prominent journalist here in Washington who had a column today in the Washington Post, David Ignatius, talking about the Syrian conflict, described it perhaps perfectly in saying that this could be the Lebanese civil war of the 1980s, but on steroids, where there are multiple layers to this conflict and there are multiple regional and international actors that have various interests that conflict, frankly. And we see that even U.S. allies such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia are not aligned with Washington on what the end game should be. And I heard this in your report earlier about what Washington's policy is. Is it to see Bashar al-Assad go? Well, there are a lot of people who just left the U.S. National Security Council and are now arguing that maybe it should not be focused on seeing Assad go. It should not be regime change in Syria, but rather containing the conflict. And perhaps that is what we should push. Certainly something that does not fit nicely with what the Turks and the Saudis want to see happen.
Good to get your perspective on this. Firas Maksad joining us there from Washington. Thanks for being with us. A lot more coming up on the Al Jazeera News.